Hi there, friends. My name is Misty Denman. I'm part of the Women in the Word teaching team, and I really and truly am glad to be here with you this morning. You know, as we get closer to Thanksgiving, I always try to be purposeful in the month of November about noticing the gifts of God, both great and small. And I have been thinking about the fact that one of the greatest gifts in my life is getting to study God's Word with like-minded women. We're getting to do that here together in a way today, whatever that looks like. It's been a anchor for my sometimes weary soul this fall, and I'm just grateful for you and grateful we get to do this together. And it's been an encouraging study for me, and I hope for you as well. Before we begin chapter 22 today, and I love this chapter, I want to go back and remember how we finished chapter 21. And I put it on our verse sheet because it has been an exceptionally long last 7 days in our world. And if you can't remember how chapter 21 ended, I don't blame you. So before we begin chapter 22, let's look back at the very end. This is just the last two verses of chapter 21. Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. I don't know about you, but it feels very much like to me that the book of Joshua could have ended right there, and we could have put, and they lived happily ever after at the end, and I would have been pretty glad about that. But we know that this is a real life story. Real life stories don't usually end that way. And I'm actually really glad that we get a little bit more to it, because I have learned so much from chapter 22. I've learned how good leadership makes all the difference in tricky situations, how important good communication and a willingness to truly listen can be, how humility creates space for resolution and true conflict resolution, and how a common devotion to worshiping the living God unifies believers like nothing else in this world can. So I'm grateful for this true story of a rock-solid commitment to walk in the Lord's ways, and for what happens when that's followed through and recorded here. So with that in mind, let's dive into chapter 22. And I think we won't have any slides up today, but I think you might find it helpful if you'll pull out at least your colored map. Actually, both maps might be helpful. I'm going to be talking about a few places, and it might help you to just kind of refer back to them if you've got them. If you don't, that's okay too. And I'm going to begin by reading just the first 4 verses for us. At that time, and that's at the time of what we just finished reading, where Canaan has been completely conquered and the Lord has promised them rest and everybody's sort of ready to go home and be settled. At that time, Joshua summoned the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh and said to them, "You have kept all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, and you have obeyed my voice in all that I have commanded you. You have not forsaken your brothers these many days down to this day, but have been careful to keep the charge of the Lord your God. And now the Lord your God has given rest to your brothers as he promised them." And when he says your brothers, he's talking about the other 9.5 tribes that will settle in Canaan. "Therefore turn and go to your tents in the land where your possession lies, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan." After all that Canaan is conquered, Joshua summons those tribes of Reuben, Gad, and 1/2 of Manasseh. And just so that I do not have to say Reuben, Gad, and 1/2 of Manasseh a million times today, I'm going to group those tribes together and call them the eastern tribes, because those are the 2.5 tribes that settle on the east side of the Jordan River. Then the other 9.5 tribes settle in what is traditionally known as Canaan, on the west side of the Jordan River. And another thing I want to mention is throughout this chapter, those 9.5 tribes on the west side, this is really challenging my geography here, on the west side of the river are called Israel. All of the tribes put together on both sides of the Jordan are Israel. I think that there's they're distinguished here by being called Israel and then Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, just so that we can keep those two separate. But do keep in mind that they are all Israel together, and I'm going to be calling them the eastern tribes and the western tribes. So why are these 2.5 tribes settling outside of Canaan, east of the Jordan? The answer to that question lies back in Numbers chapter 32. If you were with us, you might remember this when we studied Numbers a year or so ago. We learned there that as Moses is taking the Israelites through the desert toward the promised land, before they get to the Jordan River, these tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, they're sheep ranchers. And when they get to this land that at that time was called Gilgal, that is just prime grazing land. Now, we're Texans, and we sort of have an intuitive knowledge of what good livestock grazing land looks like. They get to this land and they see this is going to be great land for raising our sheep. This is our livelihood. So they stop and they ask Moses, can we settle here instead of going all the way into Canaan? Moses gives them permission to do that on the condition that they leave their families. The fighting men would leave their families and their livestock behind. They would go into Canaan with the rest of the tribes, fight side by side, just as much as they would if that were going to be where they ended up settling, do their part to help conquer the land, and then they could return back to their lives on the east side of the Jordan. And these men did exactly that. So Joshua commends these tribes, the eastern tribes, for their faithful commitment to the Lord and to their fellow Israelites during that conquest of Canaan. They have walked faithfully with the Lord. They have fought loyally beside their brothers. Joshua purposefully chooses words of praise for those deep commitments. He says they carefully kept all of God's law. They never left the side of their fellow tribesmen for 7 long years. To me, this is a remarkable picture of character and integrity. And now that their commitments have been fulfilled, Joshua formally releases them to return to their families and begin their new lives. I think because Joshua is such an excellent leader, he doesn't stop and just say, okay, we're done, you can go on home now. He does not assume that because these tribes have shown faithfulness and spiritual maturity during these years of conquering Canaan, that they don't need any more spiritual encouragement. They still need encouragement, as we all do, no matter where we are on our journeys. And I'll bet that Joshua himself was pretty ready to go home and be done with the fighting, but he keeps his commitment and follows through here too. He leads these men right to the very end, sending them home with a charge and a blessing. I really admire him for that. So this is what he says to them, beginning in verse 5. We're just reading 5 and 6 here. Joshua says, "Only be very careful to observe the commandments and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, to love the Lord your God, and to walk in all his ways, and to keep his commandments, and to cling to him, and to serve him with all your heart and all your soul." So Joshua blessed them, and he sent them away, and they went to their tents. So Joshua sends those eastern tribes home with a blessing and a charge to continue pursuing the Lord. His charge was specific, and it set the bar very high. I've thought about this story a lot. In August, we sent our oldest son off to college for his freshman year, and I'd already been looking at this chapter a little bit right about that time. And Joshua's words really were a guide for me. I was very thankful for them as we sort of had to choose some last words to say to our son standing outside that dorm room and leaving him in a new city to live on his own for the first time. And I just couldn't think of how it could be said better than this. I can't think of words that I would want to live by more, that I want my sons to live by more. Love the Lord your God. Walk in all his ways. Keep his commandments. Cling to him. Serve him with all your heart and soul. These words provide a framework for both our inner worship and our devotion to the Lord, and for our relationships with everyone around us. These words sum up what maturity in Christ look like, and they show us where Joshua's primary concern for his people were. He cared first and foremost about their faith as he was sending them off, not to be in their everyday lives again. These words recorded here aren't about important things like how to set up their local governments, what kind of taxation would be most equitable and fair, whether they should homeschool their kids or private or public school their kids. Those things mattered, but the most important things are what Joshua left them with. So when my son Ben left for school, I really wanted to tell him how he should get a planner, and on that first day of class, put all his assignments and exams in that planner so he wouldn't forget a single one. And I really wanted to tell him that even though you can eat junk all day, every day without me there, to please eat fruits and vegetables every day. And I really wanted to tell him how much better he looks if he'll shave most days. I didn't say any of those things because 18-year-old boys, or at least my 18-year-old boy, has a very short window of time when they're willing to listen to their moms and hear advice. So I worked really hard to follow Joshua's example, use my little bit of time I had with them to encourage him spiritually, because I do understand that's what really and truly matters. And I figure if he ends up with scurvy when he comes home for Christmas, I'll give him lots of oranges and vitamins. There's a cliche that I think we've all heard, but it's a true one. Keep the main thing the main thing. It's a cliche and true, as many cliches are. The main thing here is to love the Lord your God and to walk in his ways and to keep his commandments and to cling to him and to serve him with all your heart and soul. You know, generally I thought about how when we're living by these things, and these are our priorities, a lot of things in life sort of end up working themselves out, and the things that don't end up not mattering as much as we might have once thought they would have. So let's continue on. The eastern tribes leave Shiloh and they head for home. And you can find Shiloh there not too far on the west side of the Jordan River. They're loaded down with much wealth from the war spoils they've accumulated. Those will be taken home to be shared not just among themselves, but with the people that they left behind, their families, and then the other men who, for whatever reason, were not able to go and fight with them. We don't know exactly where they crossed over. It probably would have been somewhere relatively close to Shiloh. That would have been an easier than normal place to cross. Maybe it was shallow. Maybe it was more narrow. They would have had a lot to take with them. But before they cross, there's a delay. And I'm going to read about that starting in verse 10 for us. And when they came to the region of the Jordan that is in the land of Canaan, and that would mean they would still be on the west side of the river, the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh built there an altar by the Jordan, an altar of imposing size, meaning it was really, really big. And the people of Israel, those of the western tribes, heard and said, "Behold, the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh have built an altar at the frontier of the land of Canaan and the region about the Jordan on the side that belongs to the people of Israel." And when the people of Israel heard of it, the whole assembly of the people of Israel gathered at Shiloh to make war against them. Then the people of Israel sent to the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh in the land of Gilead, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, and with him 10 chiefs, one from each of the tribal families of Israel, every one of them the head of a family among the clans of Israel. So an altar is built and conflict immediately arises. The eastern tribes leave Joshua with a heart full of praise for all the great things the Lord has done for them, a charge to go forth in faith for the Lord's sake. I can imagine those heartfelt goodbyes of these brothers they fought alongside for all of these years, packing up all these great things they're going to take home with them that they get to take to their families. But somewhere in those miles between Shiloh and when they get to the river, these men decide to stop and build this great altar on the western side of the river. Not on their side, but on the side that would have been called Canaan. Honestly, there's a lot that's inexplicable here. I think I've concluded that the best way to sort of summarize what happened here is the building of that altar happened with good intentions that were probably not thought all the way through by a lot of people who probably should have just gone home, but who had been blessed or ended up being blessed by the truth that God works all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes. So that's kind of a big picture, and we're going to talk about a lot of details here. And then let me also just say an aside here and point out before we go any further that chapter 22 is really a story in and of itself. There's not a lot, it's sort of just its own little capsule. And it is also written very much like a classic short story, like you would have read in an anthology in an English class in high school or college. It has really big themes and truths told in a really short amount of time. You see tension build the first time you read it. What's happening here? What are the motives? Then all of a sudden, those motives are revealed, and there's this resolution here, and it's very satisfying. We have already, so that's kind of how you read it the first time you go through it. And I think the way it was meant, it was written purposefully like that. Really just great literature here, honestly. Because we've already studied this on our own and in our small groups, we already sort of know what the resolution is and the whys behind it. So as I continue talking about it, I'm going to talk about it with the assumption that we know the heart behind the actions on both sides of the conflict. So when that altar is discovered by Israel's western tribes, they gather for war again against the eastern tribes who built it. So why was the building of an altar a matter of such importance that, again, they would gather their top leadership together and plan a civil war against men who they had just fought beside for 7 years and had gone off on the very best of terms? The answer to that question lies in the fact that this altar was a replica of the altar of sacrifice at the tabernacle. The tabernacle was also called the tent of meeting. It was where Israel went to worship and offer sacrifices for the cleansing of their sin. The Holy of Holies was inside the tabernacle. That was where the presence of the Lord dwelt. The people of Israel had built the tabernacle according to God's very specific instructions. It was detailed, it was beautiful, it was purposeful, it was also portable. It went with Israel in all those years that they wandered in the desert. Right now, it's set up in Shiloh. And if you weren't with us when we studied the tabernacle a few semesters ago, you can read about it beginning in Exodus 25, and you'll be amazed by it all. God's law that had been given to Moses and passed down to the people very plainly said that animal sacrifices could only be made in one place, and that was at the altar of sacrifice at the tabernacle and presided over by the priests there. So when those eastern tribes build this huge altar that looks just like the one at the tabernacle, the western tribes make a logical assumption that this one would also be for offering sacrifices and that the law had been broken. And it's a law that really gets to the very heart of their relationship with God. So it's a big, big deal. Now we know, because we know the whole story, that was not its purpose, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But for now, the men of the western tribes, you have to think about how weary they must have been of fighting and bloodshed at this moment, how much they must have wanted to just go home to their families and start new lives of peace. We read right at the end of chapter 21 that God had just promised them rest on all sides. But these are faithful men with spiritual grit, and they put their own desires to the side, and they're willing to take up arms again, this time in defense of God's law and against their friends. I really admire these men for that, and they make me think of Galatians 6:9 on your verse sheet. And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are in the household of faith. And it must have seemed good to these men to defend God's law and to try to get their brothers back on track. It's easy to grow weary of doing good. I fight that myself. These men chose not to do that. So a delegation is sent to question this presumed rebellion. Those who go include a chief from every tribe. I think most importantly here is Phinehas the priest. He's a man with great passion for upholding the holiness of God before his people, for eradicating impure worship. If you want to go back later and look at a story in Numbers 25, it's a pretty harrowing tale of Phinehas and his defense of God's law. That story would not have been lost on these tribes. They would have remembered it well as they see him there. But do you notice who's missing from this group? Joshua. A great mark of leadership is training and empowering those under you to lead well. I think Joshua has done just that because these men do lead very well and he is not there with them. So let's pick this story back up in verse 15. And they, that's the delegation of the men from each tribe and the priest, they came to the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh in the land of Gilead, and they said to them, "Thus says the whole congregation of the Lord." In other words, they represent all of their people. "What is this breach of faith that you have committed against the God of Israel in turning away this day from following the Lord by building yourselves an altar this day in rebellion against the Lord? Have we not had enough of the sin at Peor from which even yet we have not cleansed ourselves, and from which there came a plague upon the congregation of the Lord, that you too must turn away this day from following the Lord? And if you too rebel against the Lord today, then tomorrow he will be angry with the whole congregation of Israel. But now, if the land of your possession is unclean, pass over into the Lord's land," that means back over onto their side, "where the Lord's tabernacle stands, and take for yourself a possession among us. Only do not rebel against the Lord or make us as rebels by building for yourselves an altar other than the altar of the Lord our God. Did not Achan the son of Zerah break faith with the matter of the devoted things, and wrath fell upon the whole congregation of Israel? And he did not perish alone for his iniquity." So, the altar is built. It's huge. It can be seen from both sides of the river. Now that Western delegation has crossed over the Jordan into the homeland of the eastern tribes. They're ready for war, but they don't come yet with swords drawn. They come first to talk, to ask good questions, and to listen. The Western delegation carefully points out the issue at hand and the devastating community-wide consequences that would be caused by the sin of these few. And isn't it good to see conflict in the family of God handled this way? The way this misunderstanding plays out just offers so much hope, and I think a method for us to follow as well. It's one of the big reasons I love this story so much. Look with me at Proverbs 1:5. "Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance." These men were wise in the way they handled this. Because absent is violence, absent is bitterness, name-calling, sarcasm, exaggeration, any kind of personal attack. This delegation simply and honestly puts the issue before them. They talk only about the things that matter here and nothing else. And at the heart of the matter is this: if those tribes built an altar for sacrificing outside of the tabernacle, that would be a clear rebellion against God's law. And you notice in just these few verses that the words either turning away from the Lord or rebellion against the Lord are used 6 times. And that tells me that is the crux of this matter and why it's to be taken so seriously. Nothing can matter at this point more than willfully rejecting their living God, which is what they think has happened. They don't have to reach very far back in their history either to point to how the sin of a few had grave consequences for the entire community. That sin at Peor they're talking about involves some Israelites worshiping and literally bowing down to Moabite idols. It was an ugly rejection of the living God, and as a consequence, there were a plague on many thousands of Israelites. The story of Achan happened just back in chapter 7, and that was when he chose to steal and lie about some of that loot from Jericho, which was to have been given to the Lord. That was another rejection of God. Both times, the sins of a few infected many, and nobody here wants that to happen again. I believe they sincerely don't want to dishonor God. At this point in Israel's history, they are walking very closely with him, and neither do they want to suffer the grave consequences they have seen others have to suffer as a result of the sin of a few infecting whole communities. Now, I have wondered before, maybe you have too, why God would choose such widespread and deep consequences and punishment for the sins of a few. And as I've studied, I've come to realize that in the early days of Israel's history, this is just a generation or so after God's law was established, it was incredibly important that Israel lay this foundation as a nation made up of people set apart for the Lord as holy and faithful. And if Israel was to learn to live and to think and to live that way according to God's law in trust and obedience, to pass it on to future generations, then sin had to be taken very seriously. So not only were the Israelites to master their own hearts so that serving God and walking in all his ways was what, as a people, they established their lives on, what they were known for, but God also intended them to encourage and govern one another, to establish a nation that trusted and obeyed the living God. And when they did not, sin would be called out and eradicated before it began to infect the whole community. And that is the heart behind what was happening here. The goal was for all of Israel to live under that banner of verse 5, to love, to serve, to cling to God fully, and to walk in all his ways. And so when pockets of the community began to serve themselves or idols instead of the living God and to walk in their selfish ways, instead of his ways, it was a matter of great danger, not only to themselves, but to the whole nation and the community around them. Most of us, including myself, are painfully quick to stray from God's ways. It seems to me that sometimes these overwhelming ways God dealt with the sins of Israel were harsh, but I think I've decided to call it a severe mercy. It was painful, but it was doing its good work to encourage holiness and faithfulness for the whole nation. So there's something else that's so remarkable to me here. The offer of those Western tribes that they make, they say, if you have defiled your land, come back across with us and we will give you some of ours. Now, given that their land was the single most valuable thing they have, to me, this is an astonishingly generous offer. And the only path to that kind of generosity was caring more deeply about the things of God than for their own wealth or comfort. Romans 12:9 says this, "Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good." And then also it goes on to say, "Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal. Be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality." This confrontation that we are in the middle of here puts love for the Lord and his people on full display. Love the Lord your God? Yes, check. That's what they're doing. It's Lord's cause that they are taking up here. Walking on those ways? I say yes, check. He laid out the ways worship should happen, and that is being fiercely defended. Keeping his commandments, serving him, clinging to him, check, check, check. The honorable way this interaction began and will be resolved is because of this. Approaching conflict with truth and love offers great hope for peace and unity. So it's definitely time to see what happens next. Let's pick our story back up in verse 21. And I'm going to read all the way to verse 31. "Then the people of Reuben, the people of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh said in answer to the heads of the families of Israel, the western tribes, 'The mighty one, God the Lord, the mighty one, God the Lord, he knows, and let Israel itself know. If it was in rebellion or in breach of faith against the Lord, do not spare us today for building an altar to turn away from following the Lord. Or if we did so to offer burnt offerings or grain offerings or peace offerings on it, may the Lord himself take vengeance. No, but we did it from fear that in time to come, your children might say to our children, What have you to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? For the Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you people of Reuben and people of Gad. You have no portion in the Lord. So your children might make our children cease to worship the Lord. Therefore we said, let us now build an altar, not for burnt offering, nor for sacrifice, but to be a witness between us and you, and between our generations after us, that we do perform the service of the Lord in his presence with our burnt offerings and sacrifices and peace offerings. So your children will not say to our children in time to come, we have no portion in the Lord. And we thought, if this should be said to us or to our descendants in time to come, we should say, behold, the copy of the altar of the Lord, which our fathers made, not for burnt offerings, nor for sacrifice, but to be a witness between us and you. Far be it from us that we should rebel against the Lord and turn away this day from following the Lord by building an altar for burnt offering, grain offering, or sacrifice, other than at the altar of the Lord our God that stands before his tabernacle. When Phinehas the priest and the chiefs of the congregation, the heads of the families of Israel who were with him, heard the words that the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the people of Manasseh spoke, it was good in their eyes. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the priest, said to the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the people of Manasseh, today we know that the Lord is in our midst, because you have not committed this breach of faith against the Lord. Now you have delivered the people of Israel from the hand of the Lord. So the eastern tribes explain what in the world they were thinking, and everything begins here finally to make some sense. The first thing Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh do, the very first thing they do is give praise to God. They say he is mighty and he knows all. It's my instinct when I am attacked to forget about anything other than defending myself. So I've really been convicted here as I've studied this. It's not what these men do. A really big accusation has been leveled against them, and the first and most fervent thing out of their mouths is to honor and worship God, not to come to their own defense or attack the other side for being wrong. So it's only after praising God that they reveal their motives for building the altar. That altar was never meant to be a place of sacrifice. Look at Proverbs 15:1 with me. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up answer. Instead, it was, so this is what we're going to see here, is they use that wisdom to not stir up wrath, but to have some conflict resolution here. Instead, that altar was not meant to be a place of sacrifice. It was meant to be a witness. It was supposed to provide this big visual evidence that even though the eastern tribes are physically separated from the rest of Israel by the Jordan River, they're spiritually united in their mutual worship in their to the one true God. Now, it is to my great disappointment, there is not a single bit of conversation recorded in that walk between when those eastern tribes left Shiloh and get to the Jordan and decide to build that big altar in the first place. I'm so curious about how they came to the decision to make this altar. Perhaps the details aren't included because the big idea of this story has a lot more to do with how Israel would live out their faith as a united people in times of peace than it does with the thought process behind deciding why it was a good idea to build this big monument on somebody else's riverfront property. The bottom line here seems to be, though, that the eastern tribes began to talk and realize on their way home that they were going to be physically divided from the rest of Israel by the Jordan River. That physical division did have the potential to create other deeper divisions within them. And, you know, the truth is, it is harder to maintain unity as a people in times of peace than it is in times of war. So their thinking just goes a little astray here, I think. I do think, as much as they had good intentions, they do let an unknown future fear get the best of them here. It really reveals itself when they say, well, we were worried that one day your kids would say to our kids, y'all aren't really a part of Israel. They had nothing to base this fear on yet, other than their own decision several years back to ask Moses to settle on that side of the river, outside of the original boundaries of the Promised Land. And If they and their children, the future generations, were committed to coming to the tabernacle, to celebrating the yearly feasts, to being circumcised, to following God's law, there wasn't going to be an opportunity for their loyalty or identity to be questioned. I think their energy would have been better spent coming up with a plan as to how all of that would happen, rather than to build the giant altar. Nevertheless, they did have a good impulse to make their public faith for future generations seen to all. There's something commendable in that. And they're successful in communicating the intention of their hearts to Phinehas and to the tribal chiefs. So the Western delegations accept that explanation of the Eastern tribes, and they take this good report back to the people of Israel. And we see that in the last couple of verses. I want to read verses 32 to 34. Then Phinehas, the priest, the son of Eleazar, the priest, and the chiefs returned from the people of Reuben and the people of Gad in the land of Gilead back to the land of Canaan, to the people of Israel. That's the other set of tribes, and brought back word to them. And the report was good in the eyes of the people of Israel. And the people of Israel blessed God and spoke no more of making war against them to destroy the land where the people of Reuben and the people of Gad were settled. The people of Reuben and the people of Gad called the altar Witness, for, they said, it is to be a witness between us that the Lord is God. Now that's not so far off from living happily ever after, I think. This was good news. All the people blessed God, and the world around Israel got to see what it looks like for God's people to do the hard work of living in peace and unity with one another. It is good and it is right for believers to fight for purity of faith and for God's word to be honored, even when that fight is personally costly, as it was here and had the potential to be much more costly. It is good and right to make judgment about others' motives only when we have all the facts. There were two sides here that came dangerously close to disaster, but peace prevailed because each side was willing to talk honestly and listen with an open heart to each other. It is good and right for confrontation to be approached with humility and a generosity of spirit. It is good and right when we are falsely accused to remember sometimes it's not personal and we can put God first and we can find a path back to unity, particularly in the family of God. It is good and right for us to carefully guard our own hearts against jumping to conclusions. And I think all of these things that are good and right ultimately flow from loving the Lord, choosing to walk in His ways, clinging to Him heart and soul. So when individual believers choose to walk in the Lord's ways, it's the whole family of God that's strengthened, and we have the opportunity to shine a really bright light into a dark world. And I want to close today with words that Paul used to close his letter to the believers in Corinth. On your verse sheet. Finally, brothers, rejoice. Aim for restoration, comfort one another, agree with one another, live in peace, and the God of love and peace will be with you. The grace of the Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all. I think that's what we get a picture of here. I think it's a great encouragement to us all, and so let's close in prayer. Lord, thank you for your word that shows what unity and restoration and peace and truth can look like. We need this now, Lord, in our own lives, I think now as much as ever. And so I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for this story. I'm grateful for your people who are willing to, yesterday, today, and in the future, do the hard work of fighting for your truth and for unity among one another. Lord, would you make us women as wise and as careful with your word and your reputation as the people in this story were? Would you give us eyes to see how we can proceed and how we can walk in all of your ways, how we can cling to you, how we can love you with every part of our heart and soul. We love you. We want to honor you and glorify you in this way. We need your strength to do it, Lord. And so I am asking for each of us that you would provide for us in this way, Lord, and you would be our strength and our wisdom. And I ask all of these things in your holy and precious name. Amen.